We are delighted to see so many people here today for our panel on how is Washington working in 2018, and to have this discussion with our two Calico Center Senior Presidential Fellows, Howard Dean and Ed Rollins, as well as someone who is working in Washington currently, Congressman Tom MacArthur, Hofstra class of 1982. Let me make some quick introductions. Congressman MacArthur studied history and education at Hofstra. His wife studied English and creative writing, I think class of 83, so we're delighted to welcome you both back. We talked a little bit about how the campus has changed. I think the Cultural Center Theater was still here, but we have renovated a bit since then. Congressman MacArthur is from Connecticut. After completing his studies at Hofstra, worked in insurance and served also on the Randolph, New Jersey Township Council. Before joining local politics, he was chairman and chief executive officer of York Risk Services Group for 11 years. On the Randolph, New Jersey Township Council, he served from 2011 to 2013 and also served as mayor in 2013. In 2014, Mr. MacArthur ran for Congress, New Jersey's 3rd District, representing Ocean County and Burlington County. He was elected, served on the Armed Services Committee and the Natural Resources Committee. He was re-elected in 2016 with 60% of the vote. He's a member of the Republican Main Street Partnership and is noted with interest groups for his bipartisanship. He chaired the Tuesday group of Republicans in 2017. Congressman MacArthur currently serves on the Financial Services Committee and also works on reforming the National Flood Insurance Program, particularly important for his district, to help New Jersey Shore residents with providing security for certainty for the future. Congressman MacArthur is also co-chairman of the bipartisan heroin task force to combat the heroin crisis that has affected many communities in South Jersey and nationally. The 85-member task force was founded in 2015 and has been essential in promoting federal action to address the opioid epidemic. We are delighted that Congressman MacArthur is here to join us today and to participate in this conversation with our senior presidential fellows, Governor Howard Dean, former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Governor of Vermont, practicing physician and presidential candidate, and Mr. Ed Rollins, one of the leading political strategists and communications experts in the United States, worked for Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and George H.W. Bush, and currently teaches the American Presidency course with, he and I are teaching that together this semester. We are delighted to welcome here today several classes, Professor Negrin's Diversity Trailblazers course, Professor Lopresti's Social Institutions course, and Professor Peronin's Journalism Tools course, along with everyone else in the students and community who've taken the time to join us today. Dean Rifkin, Dr. Carolyn Dudek in Political Science, Dr. Green in Political Science, Mr. Chuck Catullo from the Public Policy External Advisory Council, and many more. At this time, I'm going to turn the floor over to Congressman MacArthur. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Mina. It is delightful to be back. It's 40 years ago this year that I stepped foot on this campus as a freshman. It's hard to imagine that it's been 40 years, but time flies. And I haven't really been back very much in those 40 years. I moved to New Jersey about 25 years ago. But I'm happy to be here to talk about how is Washington working, understanding Washington. And I'm sure there'll be some questions when I'm done. First thing I have to say is if you're going to understand how Washington works, you have to understand the various perspectives in Washington. Understanding D.C. is about understanding people. It's no different than any other part of life, whether it was my business life or not-for-profit work I've done or now in Congress. The people element is exactly the same. Different issues, different pressure points, but same issue. We've had about 12,000 Americans serve in the United States Congress in the history of our country. And right now there's 435 members of Congress, each of us representing about 750,000 of our neighbors. That's the way the system works. There are all kinds of perspectives. People from different jobs, physicians, doctors, lawyers, car salesmen, other kinds of business people, people that are career politicians, all different kinds of perspectives. We have different racial and ethnic backgrounds, men and women. One of my good friends in Congress is a Hindu American. There's all different kinds of perspectives. And what I've found in my 4 years in Congress is most people are pretty well-meaning. There's some really smart people. There's some not so smart people in Congress. There are people that are practical and people that are really ideological. But most people that I encounter are pretty well-meaning. My own background, Mina alluded to it, but it's critical to understanding people if you're going to get anything done in Congress. My mother and father were very, very different people. My father was a very conservative Republican, and my mother was an extremely liberal Democrat. They had different religious beliefs too, so we grew up fighting over religion and politics. That was my dinner table. My father supported the most far-right candidates. My mother supported Jesse Jackson for president. That's the house I grew up in. And so bipartisanship for me isn't all that difficult. It's like dinner at my home growing up. That's exactly how I view it. My family life, as I grew up, I met my wife here at Hofstra. I had 3 children. Our first child was born with special needs. She lived to be 11 years old, and we had a lot of different medical issues during those 11 years. We adopted our other 2 children from South Korea. You think that has an impact on how I view issues like DACA and immigration? When I look at my 2 children, my 2 living children, and I see children that were born halfway across the world, of course it does. Of course it does. Every person in Congress has a different perspective. My time here at Hofstra, I mentioned in a meeting a little while ago, I didn't just find a wife here at Hofstra, I actually found myself here. I sort of found my spiritual center during my time here at Hofstra. I grew up in a farm town in Connecticut, and I got here in a much more diverse community than I was used to. I lived in Tower A in 1979 when the Iranian embassy was taken over. I don't know how it is today, but there were a lot of Iranian students on this campus in 1979. And I remember interacting with my fellow students from Iran, and they were wondering if they were ever going to go home again. And I'm sure some of them didn't, because that was when the Ayatollahs took over. So all those things have an impact. My business life has imbued in me a sense of practicality. I have my ideologies, but I'm a pretty practical member of Congress. And my insurance life, I spent my life negotiating insurance claims. Negotiating and compromise was a way of life for me for 30 years. So that affects how I do things in Congress. So what's my point? My point is, if you get anything done in Washington, if you want to know how the city works, you've got to get to the perspectives of the people that are there. It's a very human place, just like a college campus. Related to that, I want to talk about bipartisanship a little bit, because it's a big deal to me, and I think it's one of the reasons Washington isn't working quite as well as it could be. My first term was during the last 2 years of the Obama administration. Everything changed when this new president was elected. Everything. I got my first taste of it a few weekends after the election. We have a home right on East Capitol Street in Washington, 6 blocks up from the Capitol, and it was the day of the Women's March. And I'm not usually there on the weekend, but I had to remain that weekend, and for 7 or 8 hours, there was a nonstop parade of women, young, middle-aged, older women, by the thousands and the 10,000s, marching past our home. I couldn't escape it. I actually went outside and just started mingling and wandering because I wanted to get a sense of what people were thinking and feeling. it was obvious to me that weekend everything was going to be different, and it has been different. So how do you get anything done in this environment in Washington? Well, let me mention just a couple of things. The first thing is related to understanding perspective. It's about relationships. You've got to have relationships. My first week in Congress, I sat by accident on the Democratic side of the floor. What did I know? I was there for a week. I sat down, and some well-meaning person came over to me and said, you know, you're sitting on the Democratic side of the floor. I'm a Republican. So I got up and I walked across the aisle to the Republican side. And I thought afterwards, this is really dumb. I mean, this is really dumb. We have to sit in camps on the floor of the House. And so since that first week, I have made a point of taking the elevator up to the floor that puts me on the Democratic side of the floor. If I'm outside, I walk around to that entrance that puts me on the Democratic side of the floor. Now, why do I do that? It's partly a gesture. It's partly because I spend my first 10 minutes or so on the floor. Every time I go to vote, 2 or 3 times every day, I spend my first 10 minutes or so on the Democratic side of the floor rubbing elbows with people on the other side of the aisle. When they have bills that they want a Republican to co-sponsor, guess who they come to sometimes? Somebody they have a relationship with. And when I have a bill and I want a Democrat on board, I know people. And I can ask them, would you take a look at this and see if you agree and would get on board with me? Relationships are critical. Understanding the other person's vantage point. My very first accident, I was an insurance adjuster. I started my career investigating claims in the New York City housing projects. I really loved the job. I was making $13,000 a year, just had gotten out of Hofstra. I had a wife and a little baby, and I thought I was the king of the universe. And the very first accident I investigated all by myself was 2 cars banging into each other in an intersection, as simple as it can get. I interviewed 2 witnesses. And they described what they saw, what they heard, what they experienced. They could have been in 2 different cities, in 2 different intersections, witnessing 2 different accidents for the way they described it. 2 disinterested people described a totally different scenario. That is the way it is in Congress on every single issue. We look at the exact same thing, and we see it through the lens of our own experience, our own personality, our own biases, and we see and hear completely different things. The vantage point matters, and motive matters too. I try not to ascribe motives to other people. I assume they're there just like I'm there, to try to do the right thing in Washington. There is a problem, though, in Washington, and I would call it a structural partisanship. And I've experienced it in this new administration in 2 ways. On the Republican side, on my side, we hear a lot about getting to 218. Now, there's 435 members of Congress. To get anything passed, you have to have 50% plus 1. That's 218. That means something different today than it meant 2 years ago, though. When I hear the Speaker and others talk about getting to 218 now, they're not talking about 218 members of Congress. They're talking about 218 Republican members of Congress. Everything now, and this is a mistake in my view, is oriented around passing bills